Aaron Deese is a San Antonio, Texas-based author and researcher and the former editor-in-chief of Paranormality magazine.
So the Land Between the Lakes is a national recreation area which sits on the border of Tennessee and Kentucky. And it has this association with this particularly grisly event that's supposed to have taken place in the early 80s. And it is alleged to be an attack by one of these dogman werewolf-like creatures. In the 60s, that's when things get really interesting. The federal government came in, and that's when they said, we're going to turn this into a national recreation area. And all the people that lived there were, forcibly displaced. Many people lost their homes. Some people were arrested. It was not a peaceful transition, from what I understand. A lot of these folks moving out of there. And that's how it became the national recreation area that it is today.
What kind of evidence did you dig up in your home state there of Texas? Are there a lot of stories and sightings?
There are quite a few. I looked at something, the exact number always escapes me in interviews, but something like 23 individual stories in Texas, and some of those are going back a little over a century or more. They're folk tales or urban legends that have been floating around the hill country since the start of the 1900s. And then we have more modern encounters that are being reported online. Some are showing up on websites, Facebook posts and things like that. And then you have these mid-century encounters from the 40s, 50s, 60s, where you have actual newspaper articles, and some of those witnesses who were interviewed for those articles are still living today. So it was at first just this very vast and spread out table of anecdotal evidence and of personal encounters. And then in some cases we do see instances where people have taken pictures of footprints. They've recorded strange vocalizations or howls. We do have some video evidence that people have captured of large things moving strangely in the trees. So any of it, of course, we could look at it and say, well, it's just this, or well, it's just that, or they were imagining something, that's a regular animal. But when you take all of this evidence and all of these stories and look at them all together, that's when it starts to look like, okay, something very strange is going on here.
You write in Hunting Grounds, Dogmen of the Lakes, your new book, about doing a heck of a lot of research before you made the trip to the actual Land Between the Lakes. So you had a good, firm understanding of the history of the phenomena, and then you went there to work with, I guess, the Small Town Monsters folks?
Yeah, the whole project is through Small Town Monsters. They're publishing the book, and we're, of course, doing the companion documentary, Dogman Territory, Werewolves in the Land Between the Lakes, which was filmed while I was doing research for the book. So that was a whole lot of fun. But yeah, we actually went there and spent 2 days on the ground talking to witnesses and researchers who have spent collective years out there digging into this stuff firsthand.
They do good work, and those films are always really fun. So you go there, and the book tells the story of your interaction with people who'd been on the ground before, and then historical research. So maybe we should start with this, is what's the difference between dogmen and werewolves? The story about werewolves, werecats, werehyenas, those go back around the world centuries.
That's a question of some debate. There's a lot of discussion in the community as to whether or not the terms dogman and werewolf are interchangeable. Can they be used to describe the same thing? Should they be used to describe the same thing? I'm personally of the opinion that they can be used interchangeably. But when we say werewolf, that doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about a shapeshifter, something that transforms under the full moon. Those legends have been around for a very, very, very long time. But then we have this modern element where people are looking at this upright canine form as possibly being a biological species, maybe having some basis in zoology that we just haven't quite figured out yet. And so for a lot of people, that's where the separation of those terms comes from, this idea of dogman versus werewolf. Because these stories have been around for so long, because these descriptors have been used by our ancestors for a very, very long time, and that is the term that witnesses continue to use to describe what they see in the modern day, I personally am of the opinion that we can use them to describe the same thing, especially because the etymological roots are so similar. But again, that's something that people will go back and forth on probably forever.
There's also a terminology battle that could reign in the sense that if you're talking about a dogman, it's a canine that walks on two legs. You could also look at it as a humanoid that happens to have a dog head.
Most of the descriptions we see seem to involve what appears to be basically, like you said, a canine on two legs, which otherwise has canine-like anatomical features. Occasionally, we will get kind of a more bizarre encounter. There are a couple in Texas. There are a few further north. I'm thinking of Michigan specifically, where the descriptors involve a creature that truly appears to be half human, half animal, where it has the head of a dog and otherwise the body of a human being. Those descriptions seem to come few and far between. More often we're looking at least on the surface, what appears to be a normal dog or wolf that is very large and seems comfortable walking on two legs. The Michigan Dogman, well, that story has its roots back at the turn of the century as well, at least according to some reports, but there was a DJ back in the 80s that wrote a song as an April Fool's joke. He's saying, they're a werewolf. This is so funny. And then the radio station was inundated with calls from people saying, no, I've seen this thing. My grandpa saw this thing, or we're aware that this thing is out here. Because we really do have Linda Godfrey to thank for bringing widespread public attention to this Dogman phenomenon, because you would hear these stories kind of as one-offs. They would get mentioned in bigger, larger books about cryptozoology, but I don't think it was widely looked at as a serious phenomenon, at least outside of the areas where people were experiencing it. And now, jump forward to 2024, and you and I are having this conversation.
My first sort of up-close and personal account about Dogman came in association with the Bigelow Ranch in northeast Utah, now known as Skinwalker Ranch. This is a story that was told to us when I was first there investigating tales from that community. These two police officers, Native American police officers, are patrolling at night right near the entrance to Skinwalker Ranch, and they see two figures, two guys in trench coats standing with their backs to the road, and they were smoking cigarettes. And the officers flash a spotlight on these two guys who turn their heads, and they have dog faces. The two officers look at each other, jump out of their cars. These guys disappeared. The burning cigarettes were still on the ground, but dogs in trench coats was so preposterous, it seemed to me that we debated about whether to even include that story in the book that Colin Kelleher and I wrote back in 2005. But that was my first exposure to a Dogman story. And since then, because of Linda and your work, I've learned a lot more about it. Trying to separate those tales from werewolf stories is pretty tough, though.
I think there's an immediate response on the part of a lot of people, even people in the quote-unquote paranormal community. When you hear werewolf, you kind of automatically go, okay, sure, what's next? I think that's an easy thing to do. I was the exact same way. I had the same tendency. Again, when you hear a personal encounter from somebody you trust, that changes it for a lot of people. For a lot of other people, I've learned after looking at so many of these stories, when you see something like this, that's when it really changes your perspective. And I have the luxury of being a researcher, being a writer, being able to say, well, I don't really know if they exist or not. But for the witnesses I've talked to, they don't have that luxury. They've actually seen these things. I do believe it's natural to kind of dismiss it and go, okay, Bigfoot makes sense, werewolves do not. But the fact is that people are experiencing something that does not fit the profile of a Bigfoot sighting. And I say profile in quotes, of course, but it very much seems to be its own thing.
I think you do a good job of being careful in the book Hunting Grounds, Dogmen of the Lakes. You always give, well, maybe it's something else. You give alternate explanations. You point out when you don't have definitive proof as you explore these stories and encounter stories that you've been told about by witnesses. But I think you do a pretty even-handed treatment of a very controversial subject.
That's kind of part of the challenge when you're talking about this stuff and you're putting it in a format that's going to be widely distributed. You know, there will be many, many people who, when they read this book, disagree with me, and that is okay. But I think the subjective nature of this stuff, of the unsolved and the paranormal, is such that it benefits us to be as open as possible, because it may be the answer to all this stuff may be something that we've already figured out. It may be something completely different that we can't even grasp at yet.
A lot of people jump to the conclusion that if you're going to mention something that sounds like a werewolf, well, that's silly because that was all made up by Hollywood. They just created that for purpose of scary movies with Abbott and Costello or something, and that is not true. I mean, those stories have been around a really long time all over the world in pretty much every culture, correct?
Yeah, like you said, it's kind of a natural impulse that people go, yeah, this is all fiction, this isn't real. We have kind of the Hollywood era of the werewolf starting in the 40s, and it's stuck around really ever since. There's been a new iteration every decade in one form or another. But we can point to as early as 1865, Reverend and author named Sabine Baring Gould wrote the Book of Werewolves. And this was a collection of werewolf folk tales and stories gathered from all over the globe that had been around since way before 1865. If we want to go back far enough, we can look as early as ancient Mesopotamia and see depictions of upright canine forms within their mythology and in their artwork. The idea of the werewolf started with Hollywood. Like you said, that's just not true. They've been here much, much longer.
Yeah, we've all seen those hieroglyphics, the Egyptian hieroglyphics of what looks like people with dog heads, right? Is it the same thing?
That's another matter of some debate. Yeah, we hear about, Anubis, the god of the underworld in ancient Egypt, who is depicted as having the head of a jackal. And there's the idea that perhaps Anubis is a part of this kind of ongoing dog-man phenomenon, that this is an early representation of that archetype. And unfortunately, I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know, but I think it's definitely, worth asking. Yeah.
So, Aaron Deese, you do a lot of homework. You research the history of the area, the stories that have been told, and you go there. You put boots on the ground. You spend a few days out there in the trees, in the wilderness, and the darkness at night. Are you at all apprehensive about being there?
If I had been alone, I probably would have been. I was with the film crew, the STM film crew, and Shannon LeGros, of course, was there with us as well. So, being with a group with cameras and lights and GPS locators, you feel a lot more comfortable. And, of course, Jesse and Joe from Hellbent Holler were out there with us, and they have spent quite a bit of time out there. They know how to handle themselves in the woods. So personally, at the time that we were there, I didn't feel I was in any danger, but I would not have gone out there by myself. I certainly would not have gone out there improperly equipped.
In part because of the stories you've heard, and this one story that you try to run to ground in your book is the spookiest of all. Tell us the tale.
This was an interesting challenge because this story has really reached the status that I think we can refer to as being a clickbait type story or an internet creepypasta. It has been regurgitated, retold so many times that if you start trying to go do research on this, you're going to run across no fewer than 100 results for the beast of the land between the lakes. And a lot of the information that's out there is people just kind of restating the same things, citing and quoting each other, it seems like, to where you're not really sure where the root is. But the story is basically that in the early 1980s, a family of 4 was camping in the land between the lakes, and they were attacked and killed by one or more of these dogman-like creatures. And the roots of the story, at least for us in the modern day, seem to come from the 2007 documentary from Mr. Barton Nunley, Hunt the Dogman, High Strangeness in Kentucky, wherein he interviews a witness named Jan Thompson, who was a gas station attendant near the land between the lakes when this is supposed to have taken place, and she heard the story from a couple of law enforcement officers who responded to it. Now, the problem for years has been that we don't have records of these people having lost their lives. We don't have newspaper articles that seem to confirm it. We don't have really any of the stuff that you need to confirm something like this, that there should be public records of. We haven't been able to find it. But what I learned during my visit to the land between the lakes and talking to people there is that this story goes back to at least 1987. I spoke with a gentleman named Mike Smith, who was interviewed extensively for the book, and he heard this story when he was in high school in the land between the lakes area in 1987. That predates the 2007 documentary, and it certainly predates the internet age when it was very easy to pass this information around and kind of recirculate it. So at the very least, my idea that this was just something that popped up in the last few years because of the internet, that was blown out of the water when you have someone who grew up hearing this story, as early as 30 years ago now.
You did try to do some legwork on this. I'm recalling from the book, Hunting Grounds, that either you or your associates tried to find, or if this is a family from Indiana, there's got to be some kind of a record that they disappeared. Now, maybe somebody could cover up grisly murders there in the wilderness of the land between the lakes, but they would have had to disappear from somewhere. They've got a home. There would be a record or a newspaper story about a family that just vanished.
That was part of my thinking going into this, is that, yeah, there have to be some kind of record. If property is owned by someone, that's on record somewhere. Taxes are going to be collected. It's written down somewhere. And so we did a lot of digging, myself and the Small Town Monsters crew, while we were working on this project, to see, can we confirm any of this? Can we cross-correlate any of this story and point to something that says, okay, this looks like this may have happened? Just because we didn't find it doesn't mean that it's not there. Not all records have been digitized. Not all of them are easily accessible to the public. But we did dig very deeply to try and find something that could correlate this. So.
You tried to look for a family that had the first names that were given in association with the tale.
Yeah, that was kind of the place we started, because we had a location in Indiana, and then we had the 4 first names of this family. And then we didn't have a last name because that has been withheld by the person who claims to be aware of it. But what we did know is that their last name is supposed to be one of the top 3 surnames in the LaGrange, Indiana area. So that was where we started, and we couldn't find a family that fit that description.
So you couldn't run that story to ground, but how well is it known in the area of the Land Between the Lakes? Is it just known among Dogman type researchers, paranormal folks, or is it known by everybody else who lives there?
It seems to be something that's known really across the community. Again, going back to Mr. Mike Smith, when I spoke to him, he heard the story from some of his peers in high school, and he has worked as a teacher. He's worked as an educator for local kids in the area, and he's even heard them mention it. And we're talking within the last 10 to 15 years. And these aren't Dogman researchers or paranormal podcasters or enthusiasts or whatever it is I feel like calling myself this week. These are just school students. These are just kids who happen to hear chatter about this story from just living in the area. But then I have seen comments online since the book came out and since the discussion has flourished a little bit from folks in the area who are like, I grew up around here and I actually never heard this story. It seems to be who you are and maybe what part of the community that you live in. But we do know that it's still being chattered about. It's still present amongst the younger generation.
Tell me more about Mike Smith. He's a really important witness for your book. He's been there a long time. He's obviously interested in the topic. What information were you able to get to him face to face?
Mike is a really great guy, awesome dude, was extremely helpful. And he has lived between Tennessee and Kentucky in the Land Between the Lakes area for his entire life. Worked a number of jobs. Like I mentioned, he's worked as an educator, worked for the Fisher-Price Toy Company at one point in time, which I think is a fun little anecdote. Seasoned outdoorsman, spends a lot of time camping, has spent a lot of time camping in the Land Between the Lakes. And just having someone who is from that area who is willing to say on the record, yes, I heard this story before the internet was a thing, that to me was invaluable. But then in the years that he's lived there and spent time in the park, he's had his own encounters where he's seen and heard strange things that he couldn't quite explain. So he's kind of taken on this role, and he's even documented some strange footprints that seem to have, at the very least, visual consistencies with other reported Dogman encounters where someone says, hey, I documented this footprint afterward. And he actually provided a cast that we were able to include a picture of in the book showing what I can't say that it's a Dogman footprint, but it was found in an area where a sighting was had, and it doesn't seem to fit anything else that we know about necessarily. So
you've got a photo in there, and it is a strange print. I don't know what to make of it. It doesn't look like a dog or what we think of as a wolf. It looks like it has a toe.
It almost looks like a very long human print.
I don't want to get too far off the track here, but you mentioned Sasquatch, Bigfoot a couple of times in this, the comparisons between the evidence for the two different or seemingly related cryptid creatures. Are there Bigfoot, Sasquatch sightings in this same area?
They are numerous. You could start with, if you like, a publicly available research, the BFRO database, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, I believe. There are a ton of reports on their website spread out over a number of years taking place within the park and also around it. But of course, I mentioned Mike had his own encounter with a Sasquatch-like creature in the park that he saw very vividly during daylight hours. His family saw it as well, got a very good look at it. And actually a part of Small Town Monsters' exploration of this area was looking specifically at the Sasquatch Central activity, which is available on YouTube now under Sasquatch on Earth. So there's definitely a wealth of Sasquatch sightings in that area as well.
You have some really good descriptions based on multiple witness accounts. Give me the basic description of what these things look like, how big they are, how they walk, how they act, what they smell like.
The basic visual profile that we see, essentially, if you imagine a German Shepherd on two legs, That's what people very often go back to. That's the dog breed that most often comes up when people are talking about this thing. And that seems to come from the elongated snout, the pointed ears, and very often we hear that the eyes were glowing, either that it had very bright eye shine, or in some cases it seemed to be glowing independent of any light source. It was just literally glowing on its own. Sometimes we hear that they have tails, but the tail doesn't come up very much. And, of course, the major feature that people always describe that points out and profiles these locations or these sightings in the first place is the bipedal locomotion. They're walking on two legs. Very often we get sightings where they start on two legs and then drop to four before walking away, or vice versa. They start on four, they pop up to two. But again and again, we're seeing the pointed ears, the elongated snout, the glowing eyes, and the bipedal locomotion. Those seem to be the four things that really, really stick out in people's minds.
One other thing that jumps out is the bad vibes. You mentioned this a couple of times in the book, is that people have had encounters with Sasquatch, Bigfoot. A lot of them are transformed in a positive way. They think it's a really positive thing, changes their lives. But people who have these Dogman encounters, at least in this area, don't have the same type of feeling from it. They get creeped out pretty dominantly, right?
Yeah, to me, that is the most striking recurring trait of these encounters, is that witnesses are left essentially with what we could describe as being post-traumatic stress disorder. People have nightmares. They don't sleep well. They are hesitant to go into the woods at night or even during the day. And very often we're talking about law enforcement officers, military veterans, hunters, ranchers, farmers, people who are accustomed to being in dangerous situations, who are accustomed to being around wildlife. The gentleman who relayed his personal encounter to me that set me on this whole journey is an Afghanistan veteran, someone who has been in dangerous situations. And he was left after looking at this thing thinking, I need to get away from here. I need to get away from this thing. We hear about Bigfoot stories that are aggressive or that are unpleasant. There's, of course, some very famous and notorious ones where people were alleged to have been charged at or attacked by a Bigfoot-like creature. But even if 50% of Bigfoot encounters are scary or negative, which I don't think it's that many, that still doesn't come close to what we see in the Dogman research field, where so many people walk away from these encounters going, I saw something bad. I was in the presence of something dangerous. I don't ever want to see this thing again.
And what are the sounds like? Growls, howls? What kind of sounds have been reported by witnesses?
We hear descriptions of growls, kind of that low bass, guttural growl, something that really unsettles people. That can come from a variety of animals, sure. But what we hear a lot of, and what kind of puzzles me, is these descriptions of what sound like half-human, half-canine-like growls. They'll say it's very difficult to describe, but it almost sounded like human attributes and then also animal attributes, like it had layers to it. And we live in the modern era. You can fabricate any kind of sound you like with a computer, but when someone hears a sound like this in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, far away from anything that even has cell reception, you got to stop and ask yourself, what is making that noise? What do we know about in the animal kingdom that can make that noise? So,
what do we know about the animal kingdom of other animals that we know for sure are out there? You have bears in this area? Do you have wolves?
Bears. We kind of have wolves coming back into the population, is what I understand. They were very prominent in the area at one time, like they were in a lot of parts of the United States. They were hunted and pushed out because they pose threats to human populations. It's just kind of what people have been doing with wolves for the last few centuries, is pushing them out. But they're being reintroduced through breeding programs. You can see them at the LBL Visitors Center when you get in there. They have a population of red wolves you can check out. We have coyotes, we have foxes, we have, of course, domestic dog breeds that are out in the wild. Wild dogs are a thing. So there is quite a bit of wildlife in the park. So there is precedent for the idea that some of these sightings may be coming from normal animals and they're being seen in the dark at a distance when a person is under duress. So there is some room for that there, certainly. Yeah. Do
you have any actual injuries or attacks that you could confirm? I know we were talking about this family from Indiana that folklore has it they were shredded, that you couldn't run down. But are there any cases where you were able to confirm something really did attack these people out there?
Not that I can confirm to a documented certainty, unfortunately. We do have anecdotes from law enforcement personnel that have worked in the area. I'm speaking of Mr. Martin Grove specifically, who's a witness that was interviewed extensively for the book and the film. And there are quite a few stories of people being attacked, of people being injured, And then the idea seems to be that the reports have either been kept quiet or they have never been written down at all, because there is a desire, for some reason, on the part of the powers that be, whoever that is, to keep chatter about these things quiet and kind of keep it confined to the local law enforcement community. We could speculate as to how much sense that makes, but that's basically what we have. Unfortunately, what we don't have, at least in front of me, are documented records of this person was attacked by an upright canine form on X date that I have access to. But again, we have people like Martin who have worked in law enforcement in the area for a very long time who have said those reports do exist.
He was a really key witness for your book. Is there a paper trail of reports where people say, oh my gosh, comes screaming back into town and goes to the sheriff or the cops and says, I just saw this upright wolf. You got to go out there and look at it. Or maybe a report goes to Fish and Wildlife. Is there anything like that that shows up in a government document or a law enforcement document that you were able to get your hands on?
It's kind of the same thing there, unfortunately. A lot of anecdote, a lot of chatter, a lot of secondhand, but those documents, unfortunately, have not found their way to my desk as of yet.
Is there any connection with the full moon in the werewolf lore? Maybe this is part that's made up by Hollywood. Have you checked the possible connection there?
That's a really good question, and that's something I'm kind of early on in looking at, which might sound strange given the amount of time I've been reading up on werewolves. But we do see a few sightings where the witness specifically pointed out, this took place when the moon was almost at full, or this took place during the full moon. And if we go back and look at lunar records for those dates, it turns out they were right. It did. I can't say that, these always happen during the full moon, or there's a one-to-one correlation in every case. But there are several anecdotes that indicate that at the very least, the moon was nearing or was in full phase. And we have a lot of folklore and mythology that is tied to the phases of the moon and, what the celestial bodies of the sky are doing, not just, of course, with relation to werewolves, but pretty much across the spectrum. So connections there, that's the difficult thing to guess at, but there does seem to be some correlation at some level.
You and your wife have sort of broad interests on the subject matter. You're not just stuck with Dogman. You investigate and look into a lot of different kinds of reports. And as you note, there's a sort of the terms that are used, supernatural and paranormal, are sometimes used interchangeably. You've got cryptids, you've got UFOs, skinwalkers, folklore. A lot of people are uncomfortable in crossing imaginary lines between those subjects. UFO people in general don't like the Bigfoot people, and ghost hunters, and they all hate each other. Is there overlap, do you think, with Dogman and these other things? And does it make you think that maybe what we see, reports of Dogman, are not really Dogman? They're some kind of shape-shifting entity that appears in different guises to different people?
I think there's definitely some room for that. And I think there is even more room for that idea if we look at this through the lens of being something that is more supernatural, that is more paranormal. And I mean that as a separation from, this is an unclassified species, or this is a mutant or a hybrid, or the result of crossbreeding between different canines, that's resulting in these upright amalgamations. And I do think there's room to make that argument. But if we look at some of the more bizarre aspects, cases where they do seem to change shape, or they do seem to move from 2 legs to 4 legs, we have instances where people have said, I felt like I experienced some kind of telepathic communication from this thing. If we look at it that way, and we're open to the idea of a spiritual or a spectral realm, the idea of some kind of a trickster, shapeshifter entity that presents itself to different people in varying forms, that starts to make sense in a certain way. Yeah, I realize saying that starts to make sense, followed by everything I just said, seems kind of wild. But it would seem to cover some of the more bizarre aspects of the phenomenon, which don't seem to fit inside the zoological kingdom.
Mainstream journalists, academics, the hardcore debunkers, they don't want to hear about Bigfoot standing next to a landed UFO or ghostly type events, what sounds like poltergeist activity occurring in the same place where there are animal mutilations. They're all kind of weird, let alone be in the same place at the same time, like at Skinwalker Ranch. But those stories do happen. A lot of times those kind of reports come in. It makes you wonder if they're all somehow related. You don't have any bodies of dogmen, no bones of dogmen, no remains. No one's found a cave where dogmen live, right? So it makes you wonder, are they actually flesh and blood? Or if they're flesh and blood sometimes, or they are only flesh and blood when they enter our world, they go somewhere else. I mean, no one's happy talking about that. It makes it easy to debunk it, to discourage academics from digging into it. You know, I learned that dealing with Skinwalker Ranch. It's too easy for someone to make fun of it. Ghost hunting and werewolves. Agree?
Absolutely, yeah. And like we said earlier, when you're talking about something that is so inundated in Hollywood and so inundated in pop culture, it's easy to write it off and it's easy to dismiss it. But we could say the same thing about ghosts. There are a lot of movies about ghosts, and a lot of people experience what they classify as ghostly activity. So, you know, there's always a crossover between real-life paranormal experiences and what we see in fiction and what we see in movies. There is a tendency to look at this on the surface and go, yeah, no, that's fake.
You've got a witness that is an important part of your book, Hunting Grounds, named Martin Groves. This is a retired lawman. He's an experienced hunter and outdoorsman. He knows that area of the country really well. He is not a kook. And wow, does he have some interesting information to share. And he is definitely somebody who takes this seriously, right?
We could do a whole show just talking about Martin and the information he's documented out there. But yeah, he's, like you said, a law enforcement officer who operated in that area for over 30 years. And he received reports fairly regularly about these upright canines and, you know, didn't necessarily take them too seriously, but then had his own encounter with one that he describes in vivid detail. He's out with a colleague hunting in the land between the lakes, taking a break from, you know, being a cop, very stressful job, and he's followed back to his campsite by what he sees, you know, this large, shaggy form in the woods with glowing red eyes. That's one of the most striking aspects he mentioned. It follows him back to his campsite. Some events transpire. And long story short, he and his hunting partner end up fleeing this campsite in the middle of the night. And as they look back, they see these two bipedal canines just tearing the place apart, ripping up the tent, you know, laying waste to it. And as they're on their way out of the woods, they see what looks like to them a pair of Sasquatch, kind of in the same area. And this has resulted in quite a bit of speculation from myself and other people in the community as to, okay, well, what could the relationship between these beings be? What was the intent of the Dogman versus the Bigfoot? You know, why were they in the same spot? But you're talking about a guy who is known in his area, who has a reputation as being an honest and honorable man, not someone who makes things up and pulls off hoaxes and stuff like that. And he's got this story, this encounter that really just kind of subverts your expectations. Even as a researcher and an enthusiast, I'm sitting here going, this is incredibly interesting. Martin's a very, very key part and when you start looking at this stuff with regard to this area, because after he had his own encounter, he started documenting this stuff. And now he has 2 books out where he has really just a case file of encounters of these things in the Land Between the Lakes area.
Yeah, he sounds like somebody who knows how to take care of himself, and for him to take it seriously and solemnly is the sort of what comes through in your book. I give that a certain amount of credence there, just based on who he is.
I think you always have to look, and I think it's important to look at witness motivations. Why is this person coming forward? Do they have something to lose? And Mr. Groves has quite a bit to lose. You know, he has family. He has friends. He lives in a fairly small community. He's not just shouting wildly into the dark on an internet forum under an anonymous handle. You know, there is a risk involved here.
Are there recordings of any Dogman-type vocalizations?
With Dogman, you have some really interesting, some really compelling audio. You can find some on the North American Dogman Project website, the NADP. We documented some in Texas for the Texas Dogman Triangle, which also has a companion film. I had the opportunity to be in that with Shannon LeGros. And we spoke with a gentleman named Tex Wesson, who, you know, a gentleman he works with who's a field researcher sent to him. And it's this very chilling, strange, canine-like howling noise that they captured in the woods. So we do have some of that. The difficulty, of course, comes from, well, it sounds like a canine. It's probably a regular canine. But what's interesting is that these captures are taking places in areas where we have visual sightings. So, of course, we can't make a one-to-one and say, this is definitely Dogman audio. The Dogman we see in the Land Between the Lakes may have a connection to or somehow be an incarnation of the Rougarou, because we know we had French settlers in the Land Between the Lakes who would have brought some of these stories with them. But the Rougarou is so interesting because it does have a lot of those spiritual connotations, and it does have ties to religion, and it becomes a cautionary tale in some communities as much as a cryptozoological inquiry for people that study this stuff as an outside interest. So I do think that's something that we need to do more research on. We need to look more closely at is the roots and the lineage of these things as they go back into the historical record, and they've stuck around with us for so long. And especially in places like Louisiana, where it is a cultural thing that is very deeply ingrained in some communities. That's, I think, where we need to look.